and Harran as relay stations, and similar accounts by the historians Al-Mas'udi, Ali ibn Ridwan. The Cairene colleagues will know him. He was a medical author from Gizeh. And Hibatullah al-Jumai is another author, the Jewish physician to the Sultan Salah ad-Din, who wrote on this historiographical question of how the road went from Alexandria to Baghdad. Now, the latter two physicians attribute a general decay of the medical art after the one and only Galen, the arch-physician after Hippocrates, of course, to the Alexandrian Christian authorities. Again, the Christians are the bad ones, who, they write, had no interest in intellectual matters and were content to work with abridged and popularized compendia and textbooks called the Summaria Alexandrinorum. In Arabic, it's Al-Jawami' al-Iskandaraniyin, condensed textbooks of the mostly writings of the physician of Galen. Now, recent scholarship has indicated a political interest, as is documented in the accounts mentioned above, that reflects the policy of the Abbasids to highlight their humanist role in safeguarding the heritage of Greek scholarship, contrary to the policy of the Byzantines. As a matter of fact, the tradition from Alexandria to Baghdad was carried to a considerable extent, but not exclusively, by Christian teachers and writers. So there are conflicting reports. More importantly, the chain of that tradition was by no means a single and continuous route. Rather, one has to assume a simultaneous existence of philosophical and medical schools in the Hellenized cities of the Near East. Now, the catchword Christian teachers and writers brings us to part 4. What was the role of the translators from Greek into Arabic, and what were their methods? In the first place, who were the translators? A few of them were Syriac-speaking pagans, the Sabian scholars of Harran, who also knew Greek as their religious language, that of late pagan spirituality. The vast majority, however, were Aramaic, Syriac-speaking Christians who knew Greek as a liturgical language and, given the pre-Islamic Greco-Syriac scientific translations, in some cases also as a scientific language. These translators from Greek and Syriac themselves belong to the Christian churches dominant in the Fertile Crescent. We have Melkites or Orthodox like Bitriq and Yahya ibn Bitriq, his son, and Qusta ibn Luqa. We have Jacobites like Abd al-Masih ibn Na'ima al-Himsi and Yahya ibn Adi. And we have prominently Nestorians like the family of the best translator of them all, Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Matta ibn Yunus. Now, this is, as you see, an extraordinarily felicitous coincidence in intellectual history. We have a bulk of fascinating scientific literature organized and prepared for study in schools, mainly done in Alexandria. We have highly motivated circles right at the Abbasid court commissioning the translation of these works. And we have more or less trilingual translators, Greek, Syriac, Arabic, prepared to undertake this task. For a philologian like myself, it is fascinating to follow the course of consecutive translations undertaken in the two, that is to say, the 8th to the 10th centuries. And I would very much like to go into this particular questions of how the translation technique was changing during this time for the better, but my personal ethics of education tell me that I might, at this point of my lecture, strain your patience too much. Suffice it to point out the linguistic difficulties that the translators from Greek into Arabic, two very different language faced. Just a few remarks. There are basically two problems, one of scientific terminology and one of syntax. And in terminology, we can distinguish between three approaches to tackle the problem. One is the simplest, of course, transcription. Some of these transcriptions exist still today in modern Arabic, like musiqi or musiqa, taken, of course, from Greek musike, or the term geographia, sometimes supplanted by the word surat al-ard, or the word, I don't know whether you still have it in your language, melancholia, does it say something? No. Which is melancholy, and this is, all of them are the type translated. Well, it's al-mirra as-sawda, and the temperament which is based on that, melancholy. Now that would be one approach. A second approach would be what is it called? Lehnübersetzung, I think loan translation. You will see in a second what I mean by it. A translation of the constituents of the parts of a given word. For instance, you have in Greek leptomeres, which means fine or delicate in regard of a part, organ of the body, translated in Arabic very elegantly by Latif al-Ajza. You have the leptos by Latif and the meres by Juz or Ajza. Or a plant I have noted here called potamogeiton, literally to be translated as a neighbor of a river, potamos, river, a kind of herb also used for medical treatment, translated very elegantly again into Arabic as jar an-nahr. So that the same plant is called jar an-nahr. And thirdly, you have an equally elegant way of opening new fields of terminology by coining a given Arabic word with a terminological function. For instance, qiyas, which actually means measuring, something like that, takes on the terminological function in fiqh as analogical reasoning, and in logic as syllogistic operation. And even more interesting is the field of syntax, but I'll spare you that. Just one final point. Much of what Hunayn ibn Ishaq, he died in 873, and his colleagues achieved in this respect in making their Arabic language surrounding them malleable, as it were. What they achieved found its way into post-classical Arabic and is now part of everyday educated Arabic. Now, for my last questions, what are the main elements of impact that the reception of Hellenistic scholarship in Islam had? I can point to no less than 4 features that have already been mentioned. One, the philosophical, medical, natural science related works that were translated in themselves immensely added to the public knowledge and research in Abbasid Islam and thereafter. 2, logical and other forms of reasoning refined the scholarly discourse in general. Ironically, even authors attacking the presumptions of Hellenistic philosophy, like Al-Ghazali, used the methods of logic, and consciously so. I mean, Al-Ghazali knew what he was doing. 3, Aristotelian classification of the sciences greatly influenced the Islamic encyclopedias, such as Al-Farabi's and Ibn Hazm's, and helped achieve a unified system of knowledge. And 4, Arabic scholarly language, what I just said, finally was in many ways shaped due to the linguistic challenge that the Greek scientific texts put to it. A final 5th feature consists, as is to be expected, in the influx of Hellenistic concepts into fields such as theology and ethics. And I have given you very small examples in the last box of my handout, Miskaway's Tahdhib al-Akhlaq. But I'm afraid I have to pass it over. It's from the Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, the refinement of character, if you want, by the famous historian and philosopher, a rare combination, historian and philosopher, Miskaway, from Buyid times. He died in 1030. The context is the hierarchy of the virtues, fada'il, the lowest of which are enacted in the world of the senses, al-alam al-mahsus. It says in this snippet which I have copied for you here, and points, al-mahsus. Note that already here the principle of moderation, a catchword which was quite prominent in the course of our conference. Do you remember the not too much on this side, not too much on that side, the i'tidal, the moderation, بقدر معتدل غير مفرط, Miskaway formulates, is to be observed. Miskaway then goes on to discuss human ethical endeavor without being disturbed by bodily pleasures, and points out the factors of different natures between human beings. So he maintains that not every human being has the same chances from the beginning. They have different natures, they have different start position or habits to be acquired. That's where learning begins, of education. And finally, very realistically, he says, and also finally, of the factor of chance. In a last stage, human virtue can reach a divine status, he says. This is not on your page, which has its reward in itself. It is a fascinating passage, on the one hand pointing to Aristotelian ideas, on the other leading to what Al-Ghazali will later have to say, and Sufi authors. Before closing this lecture, I would like to stress 2 crucial qualifications, in the sense of however, that we have to keep in mind when we study the transfer of Hellenistic scholarship to Islam. The first is to become or stay aware of the fact that those sciences that Al-Farabi and Ibn Hazm, and generally all authors of classifications of the sciences in Islam, enlist as Islamic sciences, such as Arabic language, fiqh, kalam, hadith, tafsir al-Quran, coexisted with and even antedate al-ulum al-qadima, about which I have been talking prominently for good reasons. But we have to be aware that they coexisted, and that the scientific or the scholarly study of the Islamic sciences went on already in Baghdad and elsewhere while these works were translated. That is to say, the texts and methods how to study the Islamic sciences were already fully developed and open to further improvement and refinement when the Greco-Arabic translation movement began. Hans Daiber, sorry he's not here and can hear me, in an essay on the beginnings of scholarship in Islam, published in 1978, writes, I quote, "The philological sciences of the early Muslim scholars are the result of their studies on the Quran. The form and the contents and the specific character of the Quran, its i'jaz character, had to be fathomed by philological means. The art of definition and the study of the connection between meaning and linguistic sign, ma'na and lafz, were at the center of their endeavors. And another field of early research was jurisprudence, which dealt with the problem of complementing the sources of Quran and Hadith by mobilizing logical, rational instruments of deductive analogy and other means. Both these fields, philology and jurisprudence, were in full bloom when Hellenistic scholarship found its way into Islam, and I venture to say that without these indigenous achievements, without the linguistic awareness and the logical refinement of fiqh developed by Muslim scholars, a proper reception of the Greek heritage would not have happened in the way it did. And a second and final point is speaking of teaching. Speaking of teaching, teacher and student, sender and recipient. It has often been stated, especially in traditional Western scholarship, that the Greeks were the teachers, sitting high up there, and the Arab down there, the students eagerly and obediently translating and copying the scholarly literature that was transmitted to them, and that there the Arabs' historical role is confined to storing this accumulated knowledge and handing it over to Western, Latin, medieval or Renaissance scholarship. This is wrong on two counts. Arabic scholarship, be it conducted by Muslims, Christians, or Jews, was a highly innovative and critical business. One of the first examples of this investigative attitude is the famous philosopher of the Arabs, Al-Kindi, about whom we know that he actively commissioned translation of a given text and creatively making use of it in the face of some problem which he was facing, be it cosmological, be it metaphysical, be it practical. A few authors, like Abu Bakr al-Razi or Avicenna, even wrote critical works against certain tenets of the ancient authorities, Galen and Aristotle. A great deal, this is very interesting and not very widely known, a great deal of critique or modification of accepted knowledge is buried in commentaries to the canonical works, and sometimes in very inconspicuous places. So it really is worth to study the commentaries, not always the primary texts. The second count is even more important. In many fields, research was carried on way beyond the literature. This is my last page. Inherited from the ancients. I wish I were more competent in the disciplines of mathematics, optics, astronomy, where, the experts tell us, scholars like Al-Kashi, Ibn Yunus, Ibn al-Haytham, Nasir-ad-Din Tusi carried their research to entirely new borders. In the fields that I have a certain command of, philosophy and medicine, there is certainly noticeable such innovations way beyond that ominous date, 1258, in which year some scholars, Arab and European, maintain that Islamic civilization went into decline. And way beyond Baghdad, Al-Andalus on the one side, and Iran, Transoxania, India on the other. But don't forget, it all began in Alexandria. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Biesterfeldt, for the very informative lecture and for sharing with us this important information.